welcome to Fools with Tools. I'm Tori, and I'll be your fool for today.
I'm Zach, and I'm still the tool.
He's always the tool. When am I gonna get to be the tool?
Maybe soon.
I wanna be the tool. So last time we covered our two-part series on derailleurs. And if you haven't seen that, go check it out. But this week, what are we covering?
So this week, we're gonna be working on the other part of our bike. Instead of doing drivetrain, we're gonna be doing brakes. So this episode is gonna be covering basic brake maintenance, and we're gonna be including pad replacement, rotor replacement, adjusting your brakes to try and get rid of any rub that you might have. And we're also gonna be doing a process that a lot of people tend to overlook, and that is bedding in your new brake pads. It's a really important step.
So last time we learned how to go, now we're gonna learn how to stop.
Exactly. So once we start working on our brake pads, we wanna be able to check and see if our pads are actually worn. For an experienced mechanic, it can be very easy to just lean over the top of the bike, look inside and see the pad material and have a general idea of if that's too low or if it's totally fine, we can keep running those current pads. For a mechanic or someone who is just getting into doing bike maintenance themselves, that can be a little bit more of a daunting task and may need a little bit more experience with it. So the easiest way to check is going to just be to remove the brake pads, and then we can use some other common household items to actually check the wear level of those brake pads. All right, so first things first, when we're doing our pad replacement, we gotta go ahead and remove that rear wheel.
Excellent.
All right, so for these SRAM brakes, we do have a little retaining clip here that we are gonna need to remove to start.
Get out of here.
Most Shimano brakes are also gonna be using a very similar system with a pin and clip on them, but there are some other brake systems that just use a cotter pin that go through the brake caliper and hold the pads in place. If your system uses that, you just use a set of needle nose pliers to bend the cotter pin straight, and it will remove the same way.
So let's rip this puppy out.
Yeah,
Let's
go ahead and take our clip off to start with. And we can go ahead and use our 2.5mm Allen. Go ahead and loosen our bolt that holds the pins, that holds the pads in place. We can go and take it all the way out.
We got him.
Got the pads out. Next step after this would be checking to see if our pads are worn out. Do they look worn out?
You know, this is my special sixth sense. I have a gift.
Right.
I can tell if pads are worn out just by like feeling them.
So for those people that don't have that gift, we'll talk about that. SRAM recommends replacing the brake pads when they're a total of 3mm thick. Brake pads start at 4mm thick. So for the people that don't have your special gift, being able to tell when to replace pads, a digital caliper is nice to be able to actually measure them. Most people don't really have access to that, so there is a cool little trick that we can do to check the thickness of the pads by comparing them to something else.
Cool.
All right, so we got our pads out. Let's go ahead and compare them to a new set of pads, make it easy for us to see the actual thickness differences. So clearly we got our brand new pads, very clean. A lot of brake pad left on them. On these ones you can see they're much more worn down. If you don't have a brand new set of pads to compare your old pads to, there's an easy little trick that we can do in order to compare thicknesses.
Well, wait, hold on a second. I don't know if I like that.
Why not?
Zach, I never asked for your 2 cents.
Good one. So when we're actually looking at the pads themselves, remember we talked about earlier how the pads are supposed to be replaced when they're a total of 3mm thick. It just so happens that when you stack 2 pennies together, they're almost exactly 3mm thick as well. So we can exactly. So we can use this as a nice little gauge to compare and see if our pad total thickness is the same height or above or below the thickness of 2 pennies.
I think it's time for a new set.
These ones are definitely a little too worn. We can see the pennies are just a tiny bit thicker than the total pad material themselves. We got everything out. It'd be a good idea to replace these pads.
Agreed.
Pads definitely need to be replaced.
Confirmed.
We've determined those are worn out.
Dunzo.
So now that we've got everything out, it'd be a good time to do a little bit of preventative maintenance on the caliper itself.
Spit on it and then just rub your jacket in it.
Something like that, but a little more sophisticated. We take some rubbing alcohol and a Q-tip and clean out all the dirt and grime we got built up all over the caliper pistons and just the inside of the caliper in general. Go ahead and spray some rubbing alcohol on the end of our Q-tip. That way we can kind of go in there and clean all the grime off the caliper pistons. That's gonna take a lot of the residual brake dust.
Oh my!
Exactly. So there's a lot of stuff inside there. There are seals on the inside of the brake caliper that we want to try and keep clean, because the smoother we can have those seals, the better your brake's gonna feel, especially if it's not filled up with dirt and other brake dust.
Yeah, we got a lot of goop off that.
Oh yeah. You watching. Next step is we're gonna be pushing our pistons back into the caliper. It's very important to make sure that you're using Important to make sure that you're using a tool that isn't gonna damage any of the parts of the brakes, whether that's the pads or the pistons themselves. You wanna make sure you're using something that is soft, that isn't going to cause other damage. I've seen some people use flat blade screwdrivers to push their pads and pistons back into the caliper, and that does all sorts of other damage to the actual internals in here. We don't want to do that. So what we're going to be using today is a Pedro's tire lever. These work great. It's got a nice curved edge and it's a soft plastic, so nothing's going to get damaged by using one of these guys. Ooh, we've got everything reset. It's time to go ahead and throw our new pads in.
Okay, wee bit nervous.
Should be really easy now that we've reset those pistons. It's gonna make it way easier to just slide our pads right in. Pads are in. Let's go ahead and throw in that last little retaining pin, and then we can make sure we put the clip on the end of it so that in the case that the pin does unthread itself, it doesn't fall out so we lose our brakes.
Which that would be inconvenient.
That would be very inconvenient.
Can you imagine? If it's happened to you, please tell us. And then put the little clip on.
Yep, snap it in place. Boom, just like that.
Done.
Now that we've installed our new brake pad, we want to go through and make sure that our adjustment on the brake caliper is okay. Sometimes when we install new brake pads, they could be rubbing against the rotor themselves. Reason being is new pads are going to be thicker than our old worn out pads.
No way.
Right. So it would make sense that they could possibly be touching a little bit. So we want to make sure that we can align the brake caliper onto the rotor and try and eliminate any of the rub that we might have. When we're going through and adjusting caliper rub, first thing we want to check and see is exactly where the caliper is rubbing on the rotor. Usually we like doing that in a quiet surroundings. That way you can really tell exactly where the brake rub is in relation to the rotation of the rotor. That way we can try and isolate it a little bit and see if it's a continuous rub or if it's at a certain spot. If it's a continuous thing, that's more likely to be a caliper adjustment portion. If it's in one single spot, where it just rubs in one spot as the rotor rotates, that's more likely going to be a bend or an untrueness in the rotor. So those are going to be two different adjustments, whether we're adjusting the caliper in relation to the rotor itself, or trying to straighten the rotor itself in order to become more aligned with the caliper. When we're adjusting the caliper, we're going to be focusing on the two main bolts that hold it to either the frame or the fork. Same concept applies for both, it's just, use it depending on which one you're going to be working on, whether it's the front or the back. Loosening those two bolts is going to be your first step, and it's always good to kind of look over the top of the caliper into where the brake pads sit in relation to the rotor. Generally, it's easiest if you have a bright surface behind the rotor. That way, when you're looking through the top, you can see bits of light coming through between where the rotor sits and where the pads sit in relation. So you want to make sure you always have light on either side of those. That way you can verify that it's not rubbing.
Like a flashlight?
A flashlight would work great. Yeah, exactly. Some sort of light source, or on it, what I've seen people do is put a piece of paper underneath the brake as well. That works great. Just to provide some sort of white light source coming through the back to make it really easy to see if your caliper is touching on one spot. Because we know if we have light coming through on both sides all the way through, obviously we're not rubbing. So we want to just go ahead and loosen those bolts and adjust to that point where we see light on both sides. If loosening both bolts and looking over the top to try and align your caliper is giving you a bit of trouble, maybe not be working as well as
it is
you
a little
might hope.
Troublesome at first.
It can be a little. It's a learning curve, really.
Absolutely.
And if it is giving you a little bit of issue, there is another way that we can look at it. The way we want to do that is starting with loosening both caliper bolts, so our caliper is loose on our bike against the rotor. And we're actually going to reach over and squeeze the rear brake lever.
Make sure it's your rear brake level.
Yeah, your rear lever. Make sure it's your rear, not your front. Press and hold the lever as you're actuating the brake, Then reach back over while you're still holding the brake and incrementally tighten your front and back bolts. What that does is it holds your brake pads against the rotor and will simultaneously align your caliper to the rotor because your bolts are loose. So if we do that, we can align the caliper using the brake pads themselves onto the rotor. So you got our brake aligned. Next step is going to be bedding in the new pads outside.
The fun part.
All right, let's go bed some brakes.
So for actually bedding in the brakes, there is a kind of specific process that you can vary from a little bit, but this is the general idea and gist that you want to stick to. You want to start by pedaling up to around 10 to 12 miles an hour, kind of a medium speed, and then applying the brakes firmly and evenly on both wheels to come to almost a complete stop, but don't come to a complete stop. Repeat that process about 15 times or so. After that, you want to go ahead and start pedaling to about 17 miles an hour, so like a little higher speed. Apply the brakes firmly and evenly on both brakes, and do that about 10 times before coming to a complete stop. After that, your brake-in process is done.
So the other wear item we're going to be looking at in regards to our brakes is actually what our brake pads are touching, which is our rotor. Rotors wear out over time, but not nearly as fast as our brake pads do.
Well, duh.
Usually,
They're metal.
Exactly. Usually you can get a few pairs of pads to a rotor. Wear times are going to be different for every person in terms of like what brakes you're using, what trails you're riding, and whatnot.
Can I help you?
So when we're looking at our rotors, we want to check and see if they're worn out. Rotors will get thinner gradually as you use your pads, and every rotor is going to have a specific measurement for when a company wants them to be replaced, when a manufacturer recommends them being replaced. Most rotors start off at around 1.8 millimeters thick, and most companies recommend you replace at 1.5. Others are 2 millimeters thick and recommend replacing at 1.7, but there is generally a wear limit on every rotor. So you guys want to check the sides of the rotor. Usually that's listed on there, and you can usually use a digital caliper to determine if it is too worn out.
Well, thanks for joining us on this week's episode of Fools with Tools. Now, if you want a less fooly and tooly
Chaotic.
portion of that, well, I would say you should check out thepathbikeshop.com, where we will have detailed instructions and more, close-up photos, along with a tool list, along with links to buy the tools on our website, so you can use the exact same tools that you saw us use in the episode. You can get all that on the website, all links below, and can be found on thepathbikeshop.com. Well, for this week's episode, I guess I was your fool.
I was a tool.
I'll see you next time. I can't do it. How do you do it?